What would you do if the only roof you could afford in the whole wide world cost you $2, and the man selling it laughed while he took your coins? That is the trade 21-year-old Joseph Foster made on a cold morning in Pine Hollow, standing in the dust with a horse, a work shirt, and every dollar his dead father's debts had left him. A weathered timber cabin, buckled at the ridge, mocked by every man on the plank walk. But what waited under a loose board on that cabin floor would carry him deeper into the hills than any grief had ever reached. Settle in, stay close, and let us know where you're watching from tonight. The wind met him before the town did. It came down off the ridges dry and thin, carrying grit that stung the corners of a man's eyes and made a horse blink hard against the light. Joseph rode in slow, one gloved hand light on the reins, the other resting on the pommel where his father's old brass buckle used to sit before the creditors took the belt with everything else. He wore a plain work shirt gone soft at the collar, braces frayed at the shoulders, and a canvas coat that had known 3 winters more than it ought to have. His boots were scuffed to the color of riverstone. His hat brim sat low. Behind him, the road he had come down for 9 days stretched empty as a promise nobody kept. The mare beneath him was named Juno. She was 15 years old, gray at the muzzle, patient in a way that felt almost human. She had belonged to his mother once, back when there was a house and a kitchen and a woman who hummed low over a breadboard. Now she was all Joseph had left of that kitchen, that house, that hum. She flicked one ear as the first low roofs of Pine Hollow came into view, as if to say, "We are here then, and we will see what here is." Pine Hollow was not much. A single road ran its length, rutted and pale. A saloon on one side, a livery on the other. A general store with a sun-bleached sign. A church at the far end with a bell that looked too tired to swing. Men leaned in doorways with their thumbs in their belts. 2 women in gray dresses crossed the road with baskets and did not look up. A dog scratched itself against a hitching post and yawned. The whole place had the look of a town that had already made up its mind about strangers. Joseph swung down slow. His knees ached from the saddle. He led Juno to the trough, let her drink, laid his palm flat on her neck a moment the way his father used to do. He had not spoken aloud in 3 days. His mouth felt like an old hinge. He was 21 years old, and he had buried both his parents inside a single hard winter, and the men in dark coats who came after the funerals had taken the barn, the fence, the plow, the wagon, and finally the house itself. They had left him the horse, because no one wanted her, and the shirts on his back because taking a boy's shirts was still, apparently, a step too far. He had ridden west, because west was the direction his father had once pointed to at a supper table, and said, if a man ever needs to start again, that is where the land will let him. He did not yet know that his father had ridden the same road once, long before, and had left something in it he never meant a son to find. The land agent's office was a plank room behind the general store, a cracked window, a stove burning green wood. A man with a red face and a waistcoat buttoned too tight sat behind a desk piled with paper. His name was Morley Beck, and he did not stand when Joseph came in. "Looking for work?" Joseph said. His voice came out low. Morley Beck laughed. It was not a kind sound. It was the laugh of a man who had already decided the price of you before you finished the door. "Work," he said. "Boy, this town's got more men than jobs. What you got to trade?" "A horse. $2? $2. Morley leaned back. He looked Joseph over from hat to boot and grinned wide. "Well, as it happens, I've got just the parcel for a $2 man." He slid a paper across the desk. A deed, yellow at the edges, the ink faded. A hand-drawn square marking a plot 3 miles north of town, up a wash and past a stand of dead pine. A cabin was noted on it. The word cabin had been crossed out once and rewritten, as if even the man who drew it had doubted the claim. "Sold to me for back taxes years ago," Morley said. "Nobody'll touch it. Roofs caved, chimneys split, floors rotted through. Snakes in the walls, most likely. Yours for $2, and I'll throw in the laugh for free." Joseph looked at the paper a long time. His hands were still. Behind his eyes he could see his father at a supper table pointing west. He could see his mother's hands on a breadboard. He could see the dark coats and the ledgers and the long empty road. He set 2 coins on the desk. Morley Beck stared at him, then began to laugh in earnest, laughed until his face went a deeper red, and he had to wipe his eye with the back of his hand. $2 for a ruin," he said. "Son, you just bought yourself a splinter with a door on it." He signed the deed with a flourish that was mostly mockery, blew on the ink, and pushed it back across the desk. "Enjoy your palace." Joseph folded the paper into the inside pocket of his coat, next to his heart, and walked out into the wind. Outside, the men on the plank walk had already heard. Word moved through a town like Pine Hollow the way smoke moves through a barn. $2, they were saying. $2 for the Morley ruin. One of them whistled low. One of them shook his head. One of them, an old man in a black coat leaning against the post of the livery, watched Joseph without smiling, and did not look away when Joseph met his eye. Juno flicked an ear. The wind pushed dust along the road in long, pale ribbons. Joseph mounted, turned the mare's head north, and rode out of town with a deed to a place no one else would take. Would you have handed over your last 2 coins for a cabin the whole town called a ruin? Would you have ridden toward it anyway, alone, with only an old mare for company? And what if the floorboards of that ruin were hiding something no one, not even the man who sold it, had ever thought to look for? If a story like this is what you came here for, leave a comment below, subscribe so you do not miss the rest, and ride with us a little further. Because what Joseph found beneath that first loose plank is where this trail truly begins. But before the trail truly began, Joseph turned Juno once more toward the general store. Because a man riding into empty country needs more than a folded deed against his heart. He tied the mare at the rail and stepped up onto the plank walk, and the talk that had been running like water along the boards went suddenly quiet, then quieter still, the way a creek does when a shadow crosses it. 2 men in the doorway stepped aside for him without meeting his eye. Inside, a woman behind the counter measured out a half-pound of salt pork and a small sack of cornmeal and a tin of matches and a length of rope. And while she wrapped them, she looked at him the way a person looks at somebody already halfway to being a story. He paid in the coins he had left. She counted them twice. "You the one bought the Morley place," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "For $2. "Yes, ma'am." She shook her head once and pushed the bundle across the counter. "Lord have mercy." He touched the brim of his hat and turned to go. At the doorway, 2 men were leaning in on purpose so that he would have to brush past them, and one of them, a broad man in a store-bought coat with a heavy silver chain across his vest, put out an arm and stopped him. It was Morley Beck himself, come across the alley from his plank office to enjoy his morning a little longer. "Boy," Morley said, loud enough for the walk, "you know that cabin's got no roof to speak of." "I know it." "You know the chimney's split from crown to hearth." "I know it." "You know a man died in there one winter, and nobody found him till the thaw. Joseph did not answer that one. He only looked at Morley Beck steadily until the red-faced man laughed and clapped him on the shoulder, as if they were old friends sharing a joke about a woman. $2, Morley said to the walk, to the town, to the pale morning sky. $2 and a saddlebag of foolishness. Boys, we have ourselves a landowner. A ripple of laughter answered him from the doorway of the saloon across the way, low and easy, the laughter of men who had nothing better to do than watch another man ruin himself in public. One of them called out that Joseph ought to charge admission when the roof caved in. Another said he ought to save the splinters for kindling. A boy of maybe 12, mimicking his elders, said something Joseph did not catch, but everyone else did, and the laughter thickened. Joseph carried his bundle to Juno and tied it behind the cantle. He worked slow. He did not look up. His hands moved the way they had moved when he had lifted the last shovel of dirt onto his mother's grave, and then again onto his father's a month behind her. Steady, unhurried, the work itself holding him upright. Juno leaned her old gray head against his shoulder for a moment and blew out warm breath, and he pressed his gloved hand flat to her neck and let it rest there. When he lifted his eye again, the old man in the black coat had come away from the livery post and was standing in the middle of the road. Not close, not far, watching him. The wind moved the tails of the black coat, but did not seem to move the man. His face was long and weathered like a piece of driftwood a river had finished with. His hat was old. His eyes were not. Joseph tipped his chin to him out of habit, the way his father had taught him to greet any man older than himself. The old man tipped his chin back. Then, in a voice low enough that only Joseph and the wind heard it, he said, "Some houses were left. Some were hid." Joseph waited for more. There was no more. The old man in the black coat turned and walked back to the livery post and leaned against it again as if he had never moved. And the town's laughter closed up over the moment like water over a dropped stone. Joseph stood a breath longer with his hand on Juno's neck, turning the words in his mind. Some houses were left, some were hid, finding no purchase for them. And then he mounted and set his heel to the mare and rode out of Pine Hollow for the second time that morning, north, into the wind, with $2 less in his pocket and a sentence he did not yet understand riding behind his teeth. The road out of Pine Hollow narrowed quickly to a wagon track, and then to a horse trail, and then to nothing more than the memory of one, marked here and there by a wheel rut half filled with dust. The land rose slowly. Sage and bunchgrass gave way to a scatter of juniper, and juniper gave way, at the mouth of a wash, to the stand of dead pine the deed had promised. Gray trunks, stripped of bark, standing in their own long shadows like a company of thin men waiting for a name to be called. Joseph rode between them. Juno's hooves made a soft, hollow sound on the packed earth, as if the ground beneath were not quite full. The wind came harder as the trail climbed. It smelled of dry stone and old resin, and something underneath both, something like ash long cold. Cloud shadow moved across the ridge above him in slow gray sheets. He passed a fence post that had once been part of a fence and was now only a post, leaning, with a strand of rusted wire curling from it like a question. He passed the bleached skull of a small animal, picked clean, set neatly in the crook of a rock as if somebody had arranged it there, and then forgotten why. 3 miles was not far by the measure of what he had already ridden. Still, it was late afternoon by the time the trail bent around a shoulder of red rock and opened without warning on the place he had bought. He drew rein and sat looking at it. The cabin stood in a shallow bowl of land ringed by more dead pine and one live cottonwood at its western edge. and the low sun coming through the cottonwood laid a long spill of amber light across the roof. What was left of the roof? Half of it had fallen inward. The chimney was split top to bottom the way Morley had said, a black seam running down through the stones as if lightning had once tried to cleave the whole house in two and had only half succeeded. The door hung on one hinge. One shutter was gone. The other clung on by a single nail and moved in the wind. Tap, tap, tap against the timber, patient as a clock. For a long moment Joseph did not dismount. He only sat there in the saddle and looked at his palace. $2, he said aloud, to Juno, to the wind, to no one. His own voice surprised him. It was the first he had spoken it in 3 days that was not answering another man. Juno flicked an ear. He swung down. His boots hit the dust with the small, solid sound of arrival. He led the mare in a slow circle around the cabin before he touched it, the way a man walks around a sleeping animal before he decides whether to wake it. The back wall sagged. A section of the north side had gone soft with rot and buckled outward. The stovepipe was collapsed into a heap of rust in the weeds. Around the west side he found a lean-to of sorts. 3 walls still standing, roof gone, that had once sheltered a horse or a milk cow, and he decided that Juno at least would have a place to stand out of the worst of the wind. He unsaddled her there. He rubbed her down with a folded corner of the saddle blanket. He filled his hat at a thin trickle of water he found seeping out of the rocks 50 yards up the wash, and he let her drink from it twice before he drank himself. The water tasted of iron and stone and the roots of things he could not name. Only then did he go to the door. It gave under his hand with a small dry cry. Inside, the cabin was one room, dim, littered with the leavings of years. A broken chair, a fallen shelf, a nest of pack rats in the corner where the floor had rotted through. A single tin cup on its side by the hearth, as if somebody had set it down, meaning to come back for it. Dust hung in the last of the sunlight in slow, pale drifts. The smell was of cold ash and mouse and old wood, and faintly, of something else he could not place. A scent that seemed almost familiar. The way a word half-remembered is familiar, sitting just behind the tongue. He did not touch anything that first hour. He only stood inside the door and let his eyes adjust, and let the place take his measure the way he was taking its. When at last he moved, it was only to clear a patch of the floor near the hearth of its worst debris, to lay his blanket there, to build a small fire in the split chimney and see whether the draw would hold. It held, poorly, smoke curling back into the room in slow gray plumes before finding its way up. He fed it dry pine and let it burn low. He ate a strip of the salt pork cold. He drank from his hat. He sat with his back against the sound wall and watched the firelight move across the timber beams above him. And he listened. The cabin spoke, the way old buildings do at night. A beam settled somewhere in the roof with a soft groan. The one remaining shutter tapped, tapped, tapped. Somewhere in the walls a mouse ran. The wind moved down the split chimney and made a low breathing sound, in and out, as if the house itself were sleeping and had not yet decided whether to wake for him. Outside, Juno shifted in the lean-to, and the small sound of her weight moving from one hip to the other reached him through the broken wall the way a familiar voice reaches through a door. Joseph closed his eyes. Some houses were left, he thought. Some were hid. He did not know yet which kind he had bought. But under his blanket, under the cleared patch of floor near the hearth, one board sat a half-inch lower than the boards on either side of it, and in the last red light of the fire, before he slept, his eye had touched it once without knowing what it had seen. He slept the way tired men sleep in strange places, deep at first and then thin, waking twice to feed the fire, and once for no reason he could name. The second time he woke was near dawn, when the sky at the broken shutter had gone from black to the color of wet ash, and the shape of the room had begun to draw itself in gray around him. He lay on his side under the blanket and did not move at once. His hip pressed against the floor, and the floor beneath his hip was not level. He had felt it in his sleep without knowing he felt it. Now, awake, he felt it plainly. One board sagged where the others did not. Joseph shifted the blanket back and looked. The board ran short, cut to a length no longer than his forearm, set between two full-length planks. Its grain ran the same as theirs. Its color was the same weathered gray. But its ends did not sit flush. They sat a half-inch below the surface, as if the board had been lifted out once and dropped back in a hurry, and no one had ever pressed it down again. He put his palm flat on it. It rocked, very faintly, at one end. He did not lift it. He was not sure, in the thin dawn, why he did not. Perhaps because a man alone in a rotted cabin learns to move slowly with the strange thing before he touches it. Perhaps because the words of the old man at the livery post came back to him then in the pale light, the way certain words come back only when a room is quiet enough to hold them. Some houses were left, some were hid. Joseph laid the blanket back over the board and rose. He went out to Juno. The mare stood in the lean-to with her weight shifted onto 3 legs and her head low, and when she heard him, she raised it and blew once through her nose. He put his gloved hand under her jaw and rested it there a moment. The muzzle was gray and warm. He said quietly, "Morning, girl." She pressed her forehead against his chest, and he stood and let her. The sun came up behind the red rock and turned the dead pine copper for a quarter of an hour. Joseph walked the bowl slow, learning its edges. He found the print of a deer in the soft dirt by the seep, and the print of something smaller, a fox maybe, crossing it. He found, half buried in the weeds behind the collapsed stovepipe, a horseshoe nail bent to a right angle, and picked it up and put it in his pocket for the weight of it. He found, on the west side of the cabin near the cottonwood, a shallow square of ground where nothing grew, though the grass and sage around it grew thick. He stood over the square a long time. Then he moved on. Inside again, in stronger light, he looked at the low board once more. He looked at the walls where they met the floor. He looked at the beams above him where the roof had fallen. And he saw then a thing his eye had passed over the evening before without stopping. On the underside of the one sound beam that ran the length of the room, above where the hearth had stood, a mark had been cut into the wood. Not deep, not decorative. A shape like a small square, and beside it a shorter square, and beside that a smaller one still. 3 squares in a line, roughest to smallest, cut with the point of a knife by someone who had wanted them found, and had not wanted them found by any but one. Joseph stared up at the mark until his neck ached. Then he lowered his eyes to the floorboard that sagged half an inch beneath the blanket. He did not lift it, not yet. He would put a day of honest work between himself and it, he decided, the way a man puts a night of sleep between himself and a heavy letter before he opens it. He went out to fetch his rope and his knife and to see what the place would let him mend. He began with the lean-to because Juno needed shelter more than he did. He cut the dead cottonwood limbs that had fallen against its west wall and dragged them into a pile. He straightened the leaning post at the corner and wedged a wide, flat stone under its base to hold it. He climbed onto the low wall and looked at where the roof had gone. There was nothing to rebuild it with yet, but he cleared the crumbled beam ends and laid the rope across the top plates so he would know, later, the length of what he needed. Juno stood by while he worked and watched him with the patient sideways look of a horse that has watched a man work all her life. By midday, he was in the cabin proper. He carried the broken chair outside and set it in the sun. He hauled the fallen shelf out and stacked its boards against the north wall for later use. He shoveled the pack rat nest from the corner with a flat rock, and the mice went out under the sill and did not come back that day. He swept the floor with a bundle of sage tied by a length of the store rope. When he swept over the low board, the broom paused on it, and he paused with the broom, and then he swept on. He mended what he could of the door. The one hinge was iron and still sound. He had no second hinge, but he trimmed a leather strap from the ruined shelf lashings and doubled it and nailed it top and bottom with the bent horseshoe nail from his pocket, and the door held. He worked on the single shutter next, wedging a shim of dry pine between it and the frame so that it no longer tapped when the wind came. When the tapping stopped, the whole cabin sounded different. It sounded, for the first time, like a house. He ate at the hearth at noon, a cold strip of salt pork and a handful of cornmeal wet with water from his hat and shaped into a rough cake, and set on a hot stone to cook. It cooked poorly and tasted of iron, and he ate all of it. Juno came to the door once and looked in at him, and he broke off a corner of the cake and brought it out to her, and she took it from his palm with her old, careful lips. In the afternoon, he cleared the split chimney. He knocked loose the worst of the fallen mortar with the handle of his knife and pulled soot and old bird nest out by the armful until his sleeve was black to the shoulder. When he built the fire again that evening, the draw held clean, and the smoke went up and stayed up. He stood a long minute watching it climb straight, and something in him, small and stubborn, took a kind of pride in it. All the while, at the edge of everything he did, the low board waited under the hearthside floor. He had passed it 20 times that day. His boots had crossed it. His broom had crossed it. His blanket, rolled now at the foot of the wall, had left its shape on it. He had not forgotten the 3 squares cut into the beam above. He had not forgotten the bare square of ground under the cottonwood. He had not forgotten the shape his palm had felt in the near dark before dawn, the faint rock at one end of a board that had been lifted once by a hand that meant to lift it again and never had. He would lift it tonight, he thought, when the fire was steady and the door was shut, and Juno was fed and quiet in her lean-to. He would lift it because a man who buys a house for $2 owes the house at least the courtesy of knowing what is under its floor. And he would lift it slowly, the way a son lifts the lid of a chest that had once belonged to his father, not knowing yet whose name was written inside. He waited until the fire had burned down to a steady red bed of coals. He shut the door and dropped the wooden latch. He stepped once outside to look at Juno. She stood with one hind foot cocked, breathing slow, and did not lift her head. He came back in and knelt beside the hearth. He rolled the blanket clear. The short board looked like nothing in daylight. In the low red light, it looked like a door. Joseph set the tip of his knife into the seam at the low end and pried gently. The board lifted the width of a fingernail, then a finger, then his whole hand, and the underside came free with a small sound, like a breath let out after a long time. He set the plank aside against the hearthstones. He leaned in. The hollow beneath was no deeper than a shoe. It had been lined with a strip of oiled canvas turned brittle at its folds. On the canvas lay a flat tin box, the size of a man's outspread hand, its lid painted once and long since rubbed to bare metal. Beside the tin lay a small cloth bundle tied with a leather thong. Nothing else. No coin, no bone. Only the two. Joseph lifted the tin first because it was the harder thing. He set it on his knee and worked the lid with his thumbs. It gave with a soft scrape. Inside, folded once and browned at the creases, was a sheet of paper the color of weak tea. He drew it out slowly and unfolded it on the hearthstone so the fire could see it. It was a map, hand-drawn in a careful hand he did not at first recognize. A wash ran up the page. A stand of pine was marked with 3 small crosses. A shallow bowl was marked with a square, and beside the square the word cabin was written, and below that, the number 1. From that square a dotted line went north and east, up over a ridge shape sketched in pencil strokes, and ended at a second square marked 2. From 2 another dotted line ran deeper, past a shape that might have been a spring or a stone, and ended at a third square marked 3. Beside the third square, in smaller letters and in the same hand, was written a single word Joseph could not at first read. He tilted the paper toward the fire and looked again. Home. He sat back on his heels. He knew the hand. He knew it the way a man knows the sound of his own name spoken from another room. It was his father's hand, the same hand that had written figures in the ledger over the kitchen lamp, that had signed his name at the foot of the note. The men in dark coats had held up to him last winter. It was the hand that had passed him bread across a table and buttoned his coat in a cold barn when he was 7. The 3 squares on the beam above him. 1, 2, 3. Joseph did not move for a long minute. He heard the fire settle. He heard Juno shift in the lean-to. He heard, in his memory, his father at the supper table with his elbows on the wood saying, "Go west, son, if you ever need to start again." He had not known that his father had ridden that road once and left something for him at the end of it. He put the map down and lifted the cloth bundle. He untied the thong. Inside were 3 things: a small brass key green at its teeth, a folded scrap of oilcloth with 3 lines of writing on it, and a single button of dark bone with 4 holes, the kind that had once fastened a work shirt. Joseph turned the button in his fingers. He set it in his palm and closed his hand around it. The oilcloth read in the same hand, "The second is closer than it looks. The third is farther than you think. Do not ride at night." Joseph read it twice. He folded it and put it back in the tin. He put the key on top of it. He put the button in his shirt pocket over his heart, where the deed lay folded already. He set the tin and the map together and covered them with the strip of canvas and left the board off. He did not weep. He did not speak. He sat by the fire until the coals were gray at their edges, one hand loosely closed around the button he could no longer feel through his shirt, and understood that a man he had buried in frozen ground a month behind his mother had gone on writing to him from a place he had not yet reached. The wind came up in the small hours. It came first as a change in the sound of the cottonwood, a dry rattle where before there had been only a whisper. Then it came against the cabin wall like an open hand. The single shutter, wedged now, did not tap, but the other window, the empty one, breathed cold air into the room in gusts. The fire lay down against its own coals and then stood up again. Juno, in the lean-to, whickered once low in her chest. Joseph rose. He put the map back into the tin back into the hollow, the board back over the hollow, and the blanket back over the board. He pulled on his coat. He went to the door and opened it a hand's width and looked out. The sky had gone the color of old iron. Somewhere north, over the ridge his father's dotted line climbed. Lightning walked without sound. The air smelled of wet stone and sage bruised by wind. This was not the kind of storm a man rides out under a cottonwood. This was the kind that comes down the wash in one long gray wall and takes what has not been tied. He went to Juno first. He led her out of the roofless lean-to and around to the sound side of the cabin where the wall broke the wind, and he tied her close under the overhang of the one good eave. He pulled the saddle blanket over her withers. He spoke into the hollow of her ear. "Easy, girl. Easy." She pressed her forehead against him as she had at dawn, and he stood a moment with his hand flat between her eyes. The first heavy drops came slantwise. Then hail, small and hard, a handful, no more, ticking against the tin cup by the hearth through the open door. Then the rain proper, a hissing weight of it, and the wind under it. Joseph was pulling the door shut against it when he heard the horse. It came out of the wash at a stumble, not a run, a leggy bay with its head low and its reins trailing, and on its back a rider bent double over the horn. The rider was small under a soaked coat. The horse came into the bowl half by accident, drawn by the one lit window, and stopped 10 paces from the door with its sides heaving. Joseph did not think. He crossed the yard in the rain with his coat open and caught the bay's cheekpiece and steadied the rider with his other hand. "Down," he said. "Come down." The rider slid rather than dismounted. It was a woman, not old, her hair dark and plastered to her cheek, her lips gone the color of the sky. Behind her, tied to the saddle in a wet bundle of oilcloth and rope, was a child no bigger than a lamb, wrapped tight and quiet in the way children go quiet when they have been cold too long. "My boy," she said. That was all she could say. Joseph lifted the bundle off the saddle first. It weighed almost nothing and everything. He carried the child into the cabin and laid him by the hearth on his own blanket, and pulled the wet oilcloth back and saw a small face, blue at the mouth, breathing. He turned back for the woman. She had gotten as far as the door on her own feet and no farther. He put his arm under hers and walked her to the fire and set her down against the sound wall. Then he went out again into the rain for the bay. He led it around to Juno's side of the cabin and tied it beside her under the eave and pulled its saddle and dropped the saddle inside the door. He came back in and shut the door and dropped the latch and stood a moment with his back against it, breathing. The fire was low. He fed it. He fed it dry pine and then a length of the split shelf board and then more pine, until the flames stood up as tall as his knee, and the room turned from cold to only cool. He knelt beside the child and unwrapped him from the wet oilcloth and stripped the wet shirt off him and rolled him in the dry saddle blanket he had pulled from Juno hours before and set him closer to the fire. He put his palm against the small chest. It rose. It fell. It rose again. He turned to the woman. She was shivering in the way that is past shivering, a slow, deep shake that would not stop by itself. He took his coat off and put it around her shoulders. He filled his hat from the water skin and set it near the coals to warm, and when it was warm, held it to her mouth. She drank. She looked at him over the brim with eyes that could not yet focus and said, "You are alone here." "I am," he said. "Then God sent you," she said, and closed her eyes. Joseph sat back on his heels between them. The wind hit the cabin and the cabin held. The chimney drew clean, as he had made it draw that afternoon. The door stayed shut on the leather strap he had cut from a ruined shelf that morning. The shutter did not tap. He looked once at the blanket beside the hearth, and under the blanket at the board, and under the board at what he had found there. The tin, the map, the small brass key green at its teeth, the bone button now in his shirt pocket over the deed. and he understood, with the clear, cold understanding that comes to a man once or twice in his life, that he was not going to leave this place until he had followed his father's line to its end. Not tomorrow, not next spring. He was going to ride it. He was going to ride it with a woman and a child in his cabin behind him, waiting to grow warm, and with an old gray mare tied under the eave he had not yet built a proper roof over, and with 3 squares cut into a beam above his head, and with one word written in his father's hand beside the last of them: home. He fed the fire again and settled to wait out the storm. The storm blew itself out before sunrise. Joseph woke to the soft breath of the child beside him, to the woman asleep against the sound wall, to Juno stamping once under the eave, and to a stillness so complete he could hear the coals settle. He rose without waking either of them, opened the door a hand's width, and looked out on a washed world. The wash below the cabin ran brown and full. The dead pine dripped. The cottonwood stood glazed. The sky had turned the pale, clean blue that comes only after weather has finished with a place. He fed the fire and put water on to warm. The child stirred first. He was small, 4 years perhaps, with wet dark hair drying in curls. He looked at Joseph without fear, the way children look at horses. Joseph gave him a corner of cornmeal cake. The boy ate it in both hands. The woman woke to the sound of chewing and sat up too fast and caught herself against the wall. Joseph handed her the warmed water in the tin cup. "Your name," she said. "Joseph Foster." She held the cup in both hands. "Ruth Halley, this is my Sam." She looked at the boy, then at the fire, then at the door, then at Joseph again. "We were riding to my brother's place beyond the ridge. The storm came faster than the horse." "You will stay till the boy is warm," Joseph said. She nodded and did not argue. He left them by the hearth and went out to Juno. The old mare was sound and dry beneath the eave. He rubbed her down, saddled her, and led the bay out beside her. The bay had a cut on its near foreleg that he cleaned with warm water and bound with a strip of shelf-board leather. Then he came back inside and knelt by the hearth and lifted the blanket and the short board and took the tin from the hollow. He set the map on the hearthstones where Ruth could see it. He did not need to explain. She read it once and looked up at the 3 squares cut into the beam above, and looked back at the map and said, "Your father." "Yes." "Then ride," she said. "We will keep your fire." Joseph rode north and east on the dotted line. The wash was full but crossable at the ford his father had marked with a small cross the size of a fingernail. Beyond the ridge, the country opened into a long, grassed park, hemmed by juniper. He found the second cabin in a fold of the land, where a man on the road would never look for it. It was smaller than the first and better built. The roof was sound. The door hung on 2 hinges. Inside, on a plank shelf, sat a second tin box. In it were 3 things: a folded letter in his father's hand, a small ledger of grazing counts kept in figures Joseph knew from his father's kitchen ledger, and a second key, brass bright where the first was green. The letter began, "Son, if you are reading this, you have found the first, and you are looking for the third. Do not hurry. The land does not run." Joseph read it once by the door where the light fell, folded it, put it in the tin, put the tin under his coat, and rode on. The third cabin stood in a small green bowl at the head of a live spring, 3 hours further, past a stone his father had marked, and a juniper his father had blazed. It was not a ruin. It was a house. 2 rooms. A stone hearth. A tight roof of split shakes weathered silver. A corral of peeled rails and a small barn with hay still in the loft from a season Joseph could not date. Behind the house, a fenced quarter section climbed to good grass and a stand of live pine. Joseph sat Juno at the gate a long time before he dismounted. Inside, on the mantel above the hearth, sat a strong box no bigger than a Bible. The brass key from the second cabin opened it. Inside were deeds, 3 of them, in his father's name and unbroken, to the quarter section under the house, to the grazing lease that ran the length of the ridge, and to the water right of the spring beneath the floor. Beneath the deeds lay a stitched bag of coin, not a fortune but enough, and a last folded letter. Son, I bought this ground when you were 7 with money I did not tell your mother about, because I meant it to be yours if the farm ever failed us. It failed us. I could not reach it before the winter took me. Write it kindly. The word by the 3rd square is the only word I know for it. Beside the letter lay a work shirt of dark cloth, folded, missing 1 bone button at the collar. Joseph sat down on the plank floor and put his hand over the button in his own shirt pocket, and did not move for a long time. He rode back the way he had come as the light turned. He reached the first cabin at dusk. Ruth met him at the door with the boy on her hip, and read his face and did not ask. He said, "There is a house. There is ground. There is water." She said, "Then your father knew you." He said, "He did." 3 days later, Joseph rode into Pine Hollow with Ruth on the bay behind him, and the boy in front of her, and Juno stepping careful under him, and the deeds folded flat inside his coat next to the map. The plank walk went quiet as it had the first time. This time it did not laugh. He went to the land clerk's office beside the church, not to Morley Beck's plank room behind the store. The clerk was a thin man with ink at his cuffs and spectacles pushed up on his forehead. He read the deeds slowly. He turned each page to the light. He compared the signatures to a ledger in his own drawer. He set the spectacles down. "These are sound," he said. "All 3. Recorded and paid. Your father filed them the summer before the drought." He looked up at Joseph over the desk. "You are a man of property, Mr. Foster." "I am a man with a house," Joseph said. Word traveled the plank walk before Joseph reached the trough. By the time he had watered Juno, men who had laughed on the first morning were finding somewhere else to look. The boy who had said the thing Joseph had not caught stood in the door of the general store and did not speak. Morley Beck came out of his plank office in his store-bought coat with the heavy silver chain across his vest, and he crossed the alley to where Joseph stood, and he took off his hat. "I did not know," Morley Beck said. "I know you did not," Joseph said. "I would not have sold it for $2. You sold it for what you thought it was worth." Morley Beck stood a moment with the hat in his hands. Then he put it back on his head and offered Joseph his hand. And Joseph took it. And that was the end of it between them. No man laughed. No man cheered. The town simply looked and let the looking be the correction. The old man in the black coat stood by the livery post as he had stood the first morning. Joseph walked Juno over to him. The old man tipped his chin. "Some houses were left," Joseph said. "Some were hid." "You found the hid one," the old man said. "Well, I found 3. The old man almost smiled. "Your father sat where you are sitting on that mare's mother 22 years ago and asked me the road north. I told him the same thing I told you." He touched Juno once at the shoulder. "Ride kindly." Joseph rode kindly out of Pine Hollow that evening, with Ruth and the boy on the bay behind him, and the deeds folded flat against his heart, and the map folded flat behind the deeds, and the bone button in the pocket over both. By the end of that first summer, The third cabin had a new stove, a mended corral, 6 head of cattle bought with the coin in the stitched bag, and a small kitchen garden where Ruth had turned the ground with a borrowed spade. The second cabin stood as a way station for any rider caught on the ridge, its door unlocked and a bundle of dry pine stacked inside. The first cabin, at the mouth of the wash 3 miles north of Pine Hollow, wore a new roof of split shakes and a proper eave over what had once been a roofless lean-to, and the shutter no longer tapped, and the chimney drew clean. Joseph rode the line between the 3 cabins once a week through the fall, and Juno went slower now, but she went. And the boy Sam learned to sit a saddle in front of Joseph on the short legs of the trip, and behind Ruth on the long ones. Ruth's brother came once from beyond the ridge, stayed 3 days, went home, and did not ask her to come with him. On an evening in the late fall, when the light lay long and copper across the grassed park at the head of the spring, and the cottonwoods below the third cabin had turned the color of struck brass, Joseph stood at the corral rail with Juno's head over his shoulder and watched Ruth and the boy walk up from the garden with a basket between them. The old man in the black coat had ridden out from town that afternoon on a mule and was sitting on the porch of the house with a cup in his hand, silent as he had been silent at the livery post. The 3 squares on the beam of the first cabin, and the letter on the mantel of the third, and the $2 he had set on Morley Beck's desk on his first morning in Pine Hollow, all sat quiet in Joseph's chest at once, and he understood that the road his father had left him was not a road to a house. It was a road to becoming the kind of man a house could be left to. Ruth reached the rail. She set the basket down. She said, "What are you thinking, Joseph?" Joseph rested his hand on Juno's gray warm muzzle and looked out across the ground his father had bought when Joseph was 7 and had never lived to walk. "I did not buy a cabin for $2, he said. "I bought my way back to my father." Ruth did not answer. She did not need to. The old man on the porch lifted his cup once toward the light and drank. The boy climbed the rail and sat on the top of it and leaned his small head against Joseph's arm. The sun went down behind the ridge in the slow way it goes down over open country, and the copper on the cottonwoods deepened, and the first star came out over the third cabin, and Juno breathed out once against Joseph's coat, and the wind, when it moved, moved gently. Thank you for staying with Joseph to the end of his road, for sitting with the grief that opened this story and the quiet belonging that closed it. If this tale of a $2 cabin and a father's hidden line moved you, leave a kind word in the comments, share where you're listening from, and subscribe so the next frontier story finds its way to your fire. Ride kindly until we meet again.